Okay, so you want to get smart on something complex, right? Really get a handle on it, but, without feeling like you're just drowning in data.
Yeah, that's the goal.
That's exactly the sweet spot we aim for here. Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating collection of insights from Daniel Yergin's The Quest.
Mm-hmm.
Consider this your express ticket, maybe. Your way to understand the twists and turns of the whole modern energy story.
Yeah.
It's full of surprises, those crucial aha moments.
And hopefully without the usual information overload.
Exactly.
Yeah, we've taken Jurgen's really comprehensive look at energy history, the tech leaps, the constant market shifts, the geopolitics. It's all in there.
And pulled out the key threads.
Pull out the essentials. So our mission today is basically to give you a clear, concise, but, really engaging understanding of the forces that have shaped our energy world from the 20th century up to today.
And looking ahead too, right? The trends shaping what's next.
Absolutely. Highlighting those key trends, potential future directions.
Okay, let's unpack this then. One of the really powerful themes that jumps out from Jurgen's work is just innovation. How central it is, and still is, in energy.
Totally. He even mentions General Georges Doria, the venture capital pioneer.
Right.
And his idea about applied science, basically putting discoveries into practical use. That's more important than ever now in this sector.
So it's like the breakthrough idea is one thing, but actually making it work, getting it commercialized.
Yeah.
That's the real driver.
That's the key takeaway. Theory is only half the battle. Application is where the change happens.
And the scale here is just, wow. You mentioned Jurgen puts the global energy market at, what, $6 trillion a year?
$6 trillion annually. It's staggering. And it's not some static thing. He calls it contestable.
Oh, contestable. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, you've got the established players, oil, gas, coal, the incumbents, right?
Right.
And they're facing off against the newcomers, renewables, biofuels, all that. It's a constant jostling for position.
And this isn't just about, which company wins, is it? This contest, this potential shift, it has huge ripple effects.
Oh, massive. Think about emissions, obviously, but also the global economy, international power dynamics, even a country's, standing on the world stage. It's all tied up in this energy competition.
It's fascinating. And Jurgen points out that the renewable story itself hasn't been smooth sailing either.
Not at all. It's been a real roller coaster, like you said. Innovation, some daring investments, but also political fights, lots of controversy, disappointment.
And then recovery, maybe some luck involved too.
Definitely luck. But now, after all that, these industries are kind of at a testing point, aren't they? Can they actually scale up, become commercially viable on a massive level?
That's the big question. But amidst all the excitement about new tech, Jurgen also flags something often overlooked.
Energy efficiency.
Conservation.
Right, the invisible energy source. He suggests it might actually be the biggest near-term contributor to meeting our needs. It's such a crucial point because efficiency gains, they can have an immediate impact. They cut demand right away.
And don't always need those huge infrastructure projects like building a whole new power plant.
Exactly. And if you connect that to the bigger picture, the players themselves have changed too. Jurgen traces how government energy ministries often became these big state-owned companies.
And then often got privatized, partly or fully.
Right. So now they're answering not just to governments, but to shareholders, pension funds, a whole different set of pressures.
And it's not just the companies changing. The whole world map, politically and economically, shifted dramatically.
Yeah, the fall of the Iron Curtain, the rise of the EU, the Euro, NAFTA, these things fundamentally changed global trade.
It's like suddenly opening up this huge, previously isolated chunk of the world, right? With all its energy needs and resources now plugged into the global system.
Absolutely. And you had developing nations growing rapidly, the emerging markets demanding a lot more oil.
Which takes us to a period Jurgen covers, late 20th century, when the oil market got really unpredictable.
Yeah, renewables, which had that early buzz, kind of hit a slump in the 80s, early 90s.
Why was that?
Well, conventional energy costs were falling, partly, and the renewable tech just, it wasn't quite mature enough yet. There was also maybe a feeling that energy supplies were secure again, less urgency.
But at the same time, something else was brewing, environmental awareness.
Exactly, climate change. It went from being a niche concern to a growing global issue. And that had huge implications for every single part of the energy sector.
Jurgen also digs into some specific geopolitical flashpoints then, like the oil for food program in Iraq. That sounds incredibly delicate.
Oh, it was. Fraught with risk. Constant uncertainty about Saddam Hussein's cooperation. Would he play ball? Wouldn't he?
And that uncertainty directly hit oil prices, didn't it? Made them volatile.
Absolutely. And by the late 90s, the U.S. policy of containment towards Iraq was visibly fraying. There was growing international concern about the sanctions' impact on ordinary Iraqis.
Meanwhile, sort of under the radar, there was this quiet revolution happening in actually getting oil out of the ground.
Yeah, it wasn't about finding massive, new, easy-to-reach fields. It was about technology.
What kind of tech?
Advances in communications, computers, IT. They basically expanded the possibilities for drilling, made it possible to reach tougher places like deep water and get significantly more oil out of existing areas too.
So it's that pattern Jurgen highlights again. People predict the end of oil, and then boom, innovation changes the whole equation.
Time and time again, new tech expands capabilities dramatically.
Speaking of changing landscapes, the collapse of the Soviet Union was obviously a massive event for energy, especially in Russia itself.
Huge. You saw the emergence of these major private Russian oil companies almost overnight.
Like Lukoil, Surgat.
Lukoil, Surgat, Yukos, alongside the state company Rosneft and smaller players. And Jurgen paints this picture of the early oligarchs like Mikhail Fridman building empires through commodities trading, which led to things like Alfa Bank.
So how did the rest of the world see this new Russian oil power? As a threat, an opportunity?
A bit of both, really. There was definitely a competitive angle. Russia had been somewhat isolated. Its industry hadn't kept pace technologically in some ways.
But also an opportunity, a huge market opening up.
Exactly, a chance to engage, invest. But there was also this big question mark Jurgen raises. Could Russia actually maintain its oil and gas output long-term without massive investment and new technology, especially in really challenging areas like the Arctic offshore?
And the Soviet breakup didn't just affect Russia. It put the spotlight on the Caspian Sea region too, right? The Caucasus. Loads of resources there.
Jurgen calls it the Caspian Derby, a real scramble.
But it wasn't just about getting the oil and gas out, was it? It was about how to get it to the market.
That was the crux of it. The pipeline politics. Fierce competition over routes. Who controls the flow? It was a battle for infrastructure, for influence.
And expectations for the Caspian were all over the place, sometimes hailed as the next big thing, sometimes a disappointment.
Very much so. Fluctuating expectations. But it's worth remembering, like Jurgen points out, this region wasn't new to oil.
Baku, right. Turn of the 20th century, a huge global oil center. Nobel's, Rothschilds.
Exactly. That history matters. It shows the potential, even if it was interrupted. After the Soviet collapse, though, places like Azerbaijan were in a tough spot, trying to negotiate huge deals with international oil companies while dealing with internal instability.
Those early negotiations sound really difficult. Unstable governments, conflict.
Yeah, the early 90s were chaotic. But then Haydar Aliyev came to power.
A former Soviet bigwig who reinvented himself as a national leader.
Right, and he brought a degree of stability that was absolutely crucial for getting those big oil deals done. Interestingly, within the U.S. government, there was this debate.
About how to handle Russia. Isolate them or work with them on Caspian energy.
Pretty much. Should it be anything but Russia for pipelines or a more collaborative approach? In the end, collaboration mostly won out, at least initially.
And that led to projects like Early Oil. Getting some oil flowing sooner rather than later.
Yes, but that was just the start. The much bigger prize was the main export pipeline, the MEP, for the huge volumes expected later.
Which meant more pipeline battles.
Round 2, Russia pushed hard for a northern route, using their existing network. But other options, like going through Georgia to the Black Sea, had their own issues, especially the bottleneck of the Bosporus Strait in Turkey.
And there's Kazakhstan next door.
Yeah.
Huge potential there, too, especially that massive Tenzis field.
Yeah, Kazakhstan also had ties back to that earlier Baku oil boom. But in the 80s, Tengiz wasn't really developed.
Why not?
Lack of investment, lack of the right technology. Tengiz oil is complex, deep, high pressure, lots of sulfur. The Soviets didn't really have the means to tackle it properly.
So Gorbachev started looking for outside help.
He did, trying to attract foreign investors. People like James Giffen put together consortiums. It was clear Tengiz was absolutely vital for Kazakhstan's economic future.
Even though the field itself was in pretty rough shape initially.
Incredibly rough shape. Needed massive investment just to get it functioning safely and efficiently. The eventual deal between Kazakhstan and Chevron was a landmark.
Billions of dollars.
Complex engineering.
A huge undertaking. Really put Kazakhstan on the global energy map.
Stepping back a bit, Jurgen brings up that historical ghost, the breakup of Standard Oil, the whole antitrust concern around big oil. Did that just fade away?
Well, the concern never totally disappeared. But the global playing field had changed drastically. By the late 20th century, those big international oil companies, the IOCs, actually controlled a much smaller percentage of global production.
Because of the rise of the national oil companies, the NOCs, like Saudi Aramco.
Exactly. These state-owned giants became incredibly powerful competitors. They controlled the lion's share of the world's reserves.
So that shift probably explains the wave of mega mergers we saw back then. Exxon and Mobil, Conoco and Phillips.
Precisely. It was partly about achieving the scale needed to compete effectively in this new global landscape dominated by NOCs. Bigger companies could take on bigger projects, manage risk better. Interesting that Jurgen notes Royal Dutch Shell kind of sat out that merger dance.
Yeah, he suggests their own internal strategic thinking kept them on a different path at that time.
Now, another recurring theme Jurgen explores is resource nationalism, governments wanting more control. And Venezuela is a classic case study, isn't it?
Absolutely. Tied to oil since the 1920s, the quintessential petrostate.
With all the potential benefits and drawbacks that come with it.
Right. You had Perez's vision of La Gran Venezuela, using oil money to industrialize. Then the nationalization in '76, creating PDVSA, the state oil company. And initially, PDVSA was actually run pretty professionally.
But then came the Apertura in the 90s, opening up again to foreign investment.
Trying to double production capacity. But political instability really hampered it. And then the Asian financial crisis hit oil prices hard, forcing Venezuela to rethink its strategy.
Setting the stage for Hugo Chavez.
Exactly. And the Chavez era brought huge changes, consolidation of power after his re-election in 2000.
And PDVSA became much more politicized, right? Lost some of that earlier professionalism.
That's what Jurgen indicates. It became much more an instrument of the state, leading to depth divisions in the country. Things like the massive general strike in 2002, trying to force a referendum on his rule.
Shifting continents now to Nigeria. Jurgen describes a really different but equally serious challenge in the Niger Delta. Not just politics, but outright violence and theft.
Yeah, a really worrying rise in armed groups, massive oil theft bunkering, as it's called, especially around the 2003 elections and after.
And this wasn't just random crime, was it? It sounded organized.
Very organized. Jurgen describes networks involving militias, disgruntled former oil workers, corrupt officials, smugglers, even pirates. It caused huge oil losses, terrible environmental damage.
And created this awful cycle, a lucrative political economy of war, as one report put it.
Just increasing criminalization and instability in a vital oil-producing region.
Okay, let's turn to the Iraq War. Jurgen notes that Iraq was already on the radar of policymakers before 9/11.
Yes, but initially the idea of including Iraq in the immediate counterattack after 9/11 was rejected.
But that shifted in 2002, towards planning for a preventative war.
Right. Based on the new doctrine of preemption, acting against a perceived threat before it fully materializes. Now, the role of oil in all this. Jurgen is careful here.
It wasn't just about grabbing Iraq's oil fields, like some conspiracy theories suggest.
According to Jurgen's analysis based on the sources, the primary concern wasn't about ownership. It was about ensuring the availability of Iraqi oil on the world market and, crucially, the balance of power in the Persian Gulf.
So the stated U.S. policy was that Iraqis would decide the future of their oil.
Yes, with a preference for a non-governmental industry, but realistically expecting that any future Iraqi government would drive a hard bargain with investors.
And after the invasion, what condition was the Iraqi oil industry actually in?
Terrible. Jurgen uses words like dilapidated and deplorable. Years of sanctions, war, neglect, lack of investment. It was falling apart.
Chaos everywhere after the regime collapsed.
Pretty much. Communication breakdowns, looting. Although, interestingly, the oil ministry itself was one of the few places secured relatively quickly by U.S. forces.
Okay, fast forward a few years, mid-2000s.
Yeah.
Jurgen describes the oil market getting really tight again. What was driving that?
It comes down to spare capacity. That's the buffer, the extra production. OPEC, mainly Saudi Arabia, can bring online quickly if there's a supply disruption somewhere. It's crucial for price stability.
And that buffer shrank.
Dramatically. By 2005, surging global demand, especially from Asia, combined with various supply problems, hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, instability in Nigeria, Iraq not recovering quickly, meant that spare capacity got really thin, tighter even than just before the 1973 oil crisis.
But prices had nowhere to go but up.
Pretty much inevitable. Basic supply and demand. Prices had to rise to balance the market. And it wasn't just crude oil getting expensive.
The cost of actually developing new oil fields shot up too.
Doubled, more than doubled, between 2004 and 2008. Drilling rigs, engineers, steel, Everything got more expensive, adding to the upward pressure.
And then there was this other factor, financialization. What's that about?
It's basically the increasing influence of financial markets on oil prices. Jurgen points out this interesting negative correlation. When the US dollar weakens, commodity prices, especially oil, tend to go up.
So oil became like a hedge against a weak dollar or inflation.
Exactly. Investors started pouring money into oil futures and other commodity markets, seeing them as an asset class, a way to protect their wealth.
Which ties into the rise of futures trading itself. The NYMEX, the New York Mercantile Exchange.
It wasn't always about oil, was it?
No. Started with things like butter and cheese, believe it or not. But as the oil industry moved away from fixed prices towards market pricing after the 70s, NYMEX became the key place to manage price risk.
Through futures contracts, companies locking in prices.
Right. Consumers like airlines could hedge against rising fuel costs. Producers could lock in a price for future sales. It brought some predictability.
And speculators played a role, too, not just hedging. A crucial role, actually. They provide the liquidity, they take the other side of the trades, making it easier for hedgers to buy and sell, but their presence also adds another layer of complexity and potential volatility.
Turning to U.S. policy for a moment, Jurgen mentions President George W. Bush's approach, described as balanced. But he did something surprising, didn't he?
Yeah, in his 2007 State of the Union, he endorsed increasing fuel efficiency standards, the CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy.
That caught people off guard.
It did, but Jurgen suggests there was clear geopolitical thinking behind it. Bush explicitly linked reducing oil consumption to reducing the influence of leaders like Ahmadinejad in Iran and Chavez in Venezuela, less money flowing to them.
Let's talk about China again. Huge story. Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening. Oil was central to that, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Integrating China into the global economy. Initially, China even became an oil exporter, mainly to Japan.
But then came the go-out strategy. What was that shift about?
It was a conscious policy decision. China realized it needed secure energy supplies for its booming economy, and the oil industry is fundamentally global. So Chinese national oil companies started investing heavily overseas.
Starting small and gaining confidence.
Exactly. Recognizing they had to operate internationally, compete for resources, learn the global game.
And that led to things like the CNOOC bid for Unocal, which caused a massive political backlash in the U.S.
Huge controversy. Even though Unocal's actual U.S. production was pretty small, the bid touched a raw nerve in Washington. Concerns about national security, economic competition.
So the lesson for China was?
Probably that investing in the U.S. energy sector would be politically difficult. So redouble efforts elsewhere. Africa, Latin America, Central Asia.
Meanwhile, inside China, the economy was just exploding after joining the WTO in 2001, especially the car industry.
Phenomenal growth. Predictions were flying that China would soon overtake the U.S. as the world's biggest auto market.
But that had a weird effect on energy efficiency, didn't it?
It did. After making good progress, China's energy consumption started growing even faster than its economy for a while. Why? Because it became the workshop of the world.
Heavy industry running flat out. Steel, cement.
Exactly. Super energy intensive. Some analysts even argued the US and Europe were effectively outsourcing some of their energy use to China by importing all those manufactured goods.
Which put energy efficiency back on the agenda in Beijing.
Right back at the top, became a major priority again.
Okay, throughout all this history, this idea of peak oil just keeps popping up. We're running out.
Jurgen is pretty clear on this. He says this is basically the 5th time the world has supposedly been about to run out of oil.
And the theories always make similar assumptions.
Generally, yeah. They tend to underestimate technological innovation and downplay the role of economics. Price signals encourage exploration, new tech, more efficient use, things peak oil theories often miss.
History shows crises often turn into gluts later on.
Exactly. Jurgen's perspective is that the resource base itself isn't the primary constraint. Estimates of how much oil is ultimately recoverable keep growing, thanks to technology. We're not running out of oil in the ground, though getting it out might become more complex or expensive.
But getting it out carries risks. The Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010 was a brutal reminder.
A terrible tragedy, that explosion, the massive spill. It highlighted the dangers, especially in challenging environments like deep water.
And the effort to stop it was incredible.
Yes.
High-tech improvisation under immense pressure.
Unprecedented engineering efforts. Took months, but they eventually capped and sealed the well. A sobering moment for the industry.
Jürgen also touches on unconventional resources, like oil shale. Vast potential, but tricky.
That's the common theme, isn't it? Resources we know exist, but figuring out how to recover them commercially is the challenge. Oil shale is a prime example. Trillions of barrels potentially there, especially in the U.S.
But we've heard about oil shale booms before that fizzled out.
Exactly. Cost and technology have always been the hurdles. Can it be done economically and environmentally sustainably at scale? That's still the question.
Switching gears to international cooperation, the International Energy Agency, the IEA. How has its role evolved?
It started primarily as an organization for oil-importing countries, a counterweight to OPEC after the 1973 crisis. But over time, it shifted.
Towards dialogue, including producers.
Yes, promoting dialogue between consumers and producers, recognizing interdependence, moving from confrontation to cooperation, underpinned by things like the International Energy Treaty for Security.
But when you talk global oil, you always come back to the Persian Gulf, the greatest single prize, as Jürgen quotes.
Its unique geology just made it the most prolific place on Earth for hydrocarbons. De Gaulier's assessment back in the 40s saying the center of gravity was shifting there. He was right.
And Saudi Arabia's position is just dominant.
Holding around a fifth of the world's proven reserves, they are the indispensable player in the oil market.
Of course, the Middle East is incredibly complex geopolitically. Jürgen talks about Iran's relationship with the U.S. after 9/11, some surprising cooperation initially.
Against the Taliban, yes. There were even feelers about broader negotiations, a brief window perhaps.
But then the game changer, as Jürgen puts it, Iran's nuclear program.
That shifted everything. The prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran threatened the whole balance of power in the Gulf, raising massive concerns for global energy security.
Another major Gulf player, but in a different energy sphere, is Qatar. What a transformation there.
Incredible. From a pretty poor country to one of the richest per capita in the world, all thanks to natural gas.
Specifically, liquefied natural gas, LNG.
Exactly. Developing their gigantic North Field. Qatar basically became the Saudi Arabia of natural gas, rivaling Russia, and LNG itself became the world's second truly global energy business, after oil.
The tech to liquefy gas isn't new, though, is it?
No, the ideas go way back. Cabot was experimenting in the early 20th century, first pilot plant in 1939. But it was the development of specialized, super-insulated LNG tankers that really made it a global commodity by the 2000s.
Allowing gas to move across oceans, not just through pipelines.
Giving it huge flexibility. Jürgen gives examples, like LNG quickly filling gaps after a Japanese nuclear plant shutdown or North Sea pipeline problems. It decouples gas markets geographically to some extent.
Then, back in the U.S., another gas revolution, shale.
The shale gas boom. Largely driven by independents, guys like George Mitchell.
His persistence was legendary, right? Kept at it when others gave up.
Absolutely. He just wouldn't quit on the Barnett Shale in Texas. Finally cracked the code, combining horizontal drilling with hydraulic fracking.
And the results were stunning. U.S. gas production soared.
Completely changed the U.S. energy picture, turned shortages into abundance. Of course, it also sparked intense debate about the environmental impacts of fracking, especially on water.
What is fracking, fundamentally?
It's basically injecting water, sand, and some chemicals at high pressure deep underground to create tiny cracks in the shale rock, releasing the trapped gas or oil. The technology's evolved, but that's the core idea.
Europe watched this shale boom with interest, didn't they? Especially given their reliance on Russian gas.
Very closely. Europe's energy security concerns were heightened by recurring disputes between Russia and Ukraine over gas pricing and transit, which sometimes led to supply cuts.
Gazprom's CEO wasn't exactly subtle about Europe's dependence either.
No, pretty blunt messages, which spurred Europe to redouble efforts on diversification. New pipelines bypassing Ukraine, Blue Stream, South Stream, Nord Stream.
And exploring their own shale potential. Could Europe replicate the U.S. boom?
That's the hope in some quarters. But the geology is different, population density is higher, public acceptance is more challenging. It's not a simple copy-paste situation. Still, the potential is there.
Overall, though, natural gas looks set for a bigger role globally. Jürgen calls it a fuel for the future.
Yeah, consumption has tripled in 30 years, projected to grow more. It's grabbing a bigger share of the total energy pie.
Why? What are the advantages?
Lower carbon emissions than coal, which is huge for climate concerns. It's very flexible for power generation. Gas plants can ramp up and down quickly to balance renewables. And thanks to shale and LNG, it's just much more widely available globally.
Okay, let's switch to electricity. Fundamental to modern life. Jürgen goes back to the early days, figuring out how to even charge people for it.
Right. Edison's initial model versus Samuel Insull's idea of usage-based metering. Insull had this vision of democratizing electricity, build big systems, achieve economies of scale, lower prices for everyone.
And he really drove the expansion of electricity access in the U.S.
Massively. His system building was incredible, but it also led to these giant, complex holding companies.
Which triggered government intervention, the Public Utility Holding Act of 1935.
Exactly. Trying to break up what some called the private socialism of concentrated power, regulating utilities became the norm for decades. Then you had the push for all-electric homes later on. GE even had a showcase home for Ronald Reagan back when he was their spokesperson.
Then came a completely new source of power, nuclear.
Driven initially by the military. Admiral Hyman Rickover and the nuclear submarine Nautilus. That was pivotal.
Followed by Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace initiative. Lots of optimism then.
Huge optimism. That phrase, too cheap to meter, really captured the mood, even if it was unrealistic. The U.S. led early development of civilian reactors.
But other countries pushed hard too.
France made a massive national commitment to nuclear power after the oil shocks. Became a world leader, still is. The Soviets also developed their own nuclear program.
But nuclear power faced major setbacks. 3 Mile Island in the U.S.
That really shook public confidence in the U.S., halted new orders for decades.
And then Chernobyl, a catastrophe.
Chernobyl was devastating. A technological and human disaster with global fallout, literally and figuratively, really changed the conversation around nuclear safety worldwide.
Later on in the electricity sector, we saw a push for deregulation or restructuring.
Right.
What was behind that?
Largely driven by big industrial customers wanting cheaper power. They looked at other deregulated industries like airlines and trucking and thought competition could lower electricity prices too.
So, moving away from rates set by regulators towards market-based prices.
That was the idea. Introduce competition in power generation, let the market set the price. But it wasn't always smooth.
The California electricity crisis being the prime example.
Yeah, a textbook case of how flawed partial deregulation could go spectacularly wrong. Blackouts, price spikes. It was a mess. Showed the complexities involved.
Looking ahead, electricity demand is projected to soar globally, doubling by 2030, Jurgen says.
Roughly, yeah. Meeting that demand is a monumental challenge, requiring trillions in investment for new power plants and grids.
And the choice of fuel is critical, especially with climate change.
Absolutely. How do you generate all that power without massively increasing carbon emissions? That's the dilemma.
Carbon capture and sequestration, CCS. Is that a viable solution?
It's a potential tool, capturing CO2 from power plants or industrial sites and storing it underground. But there are big challenges. Costs, proving long-term storage safety, liability if it leaks, public acceptance. It's not a silver bullet yet.
What about nuclear? Is it making a comeback?
The existing nuclear fleet has actually improved its performance significantly. Many plants are getting their licenses extended. And there is talk of a nuclear renaissance, new plant designs, some countries aiming for a high percentage of nuclear again, like France.
But then Fukushima happened.
Right. The 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, leading to the disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Multiple reactor meltdowns after the cooling systems failed due to the station blackout. Another major blow to the industry's image and safety perceptions.
Okay, this brings us squarely to climate change. Jurgen traces the science way back, 19th century.
Yeah, John Tyndall understanding the greenhouse effect. Then Svante Arrhenius actually doing early calculations, remarkably prescient on how doubling CO2 could warm the planet.
And later researchers built on that.
Roger Revelle studying CO2 absorption by oceans. And Charles Keeling's measurements starting in the 50s, the famous Keeling curve, showing that steady rise in atmospheric CO2. Undeniable evidence.
Although wasn't there a global cooling scare for a bit in the 70s?
There was, briefly. Based on aerosols and natural cycles, it shows how scientific understanding evolves. But the underlying physics of the greenhouse effect were well established. Early climate models in the 60s were already predicting significant warming from doubled CO2.
And James Hansen's 1988 testimony was a turning point for public awareness.
Hugely significant, declaring the signal of human-caused warming was emerging from the noise of natural variability. Though even then, scientists like Revelle urged caution about the rate and amount of future warming, acknowledging uncertainties.
Jurgen also uses Mars and Venus as examples.
Right. Stark contrasts. One frozen, one hellishly hot. Same sun, but vastly different atmospheres, illustrating the power of the greenhouse effect.
So the science developed, but then came the politics, which got complicated fast.
Very. Climate change emerged as a major political issue. The 1992 Earth Summit in Rio showed the split agreement on the problem, but disagreement, especially between developed and developing nations, on who should do what about emissions.
That led to the Berlin Mandate, the idea of differentiated responsibility.
Yes. Basically saying developed countries who caused most of the historical emissions should take the lead in cutting them, while developing countries needed space to grow their economies. That became a central point of contention in negotiations like Kyoto.
And the IPCC process itself became quite polarized, debates over the certainty of the science.
Increasingly so. Despite the strong consensus among climate scientists, the process got caught up in political battles, but figures like Tony Blair in the UK really pushed it onto the international agenda.
The Nobel Peace Prize for the IPCC and Al Gore certainly raised visibility.
Immensely. And you saw action happening at subnational levels, too, like California's Assembly Bill 32, setting ambitious state-level targets.
The 2009 Copenhagen Accord seemed like a big moment, but ended up being
A bit anticlimactic. Non-binding pledges, a target of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius, but no clear roadmap, met with pretty mixed reactions.
And the IPCC faced controversies too, right? Like that Himalayan glaciers claim.
Yeah, errors like that, though relatively minor in the grand scheme, were seized upon by critics and damaged credibility somewhat. It highlighted the immense challenge of synthesizing vast amounts of complex science perfectly.
Meanwhile, in the U.S., the EPA made its endangerment finding.
Declaring greenhouse gases a threat to public health and welfare, that was legally significant, paving the way for regulations on vehicle emissions and eventually power plants and other stationary sources.
Going back a bit, President Carter's energy policy in the 70s, he called it the moral equivalent of war.
He did, really focused on the dangers of foreign oil dependence. His big push was for energy conservation and boosting domestic coal production, kind of set the stage for later interest in alternatives.
Which brings us back to renewables. How did they really start to take off?
Different drivers in different places. Japan was an early leader in solar manufacturing, helped by government subsidies and their high domestic electricity prices making solar more competitive sooner.
Germany played a big role too.
Huge. Their feed-in law in 1991, actually based on an earlier U.S. model called PERP, guaranteed high prices for renewable electricity fed into the grid. That really kickstarted their wind and solar industries.
Especially wind power under the Red-Green Coalition government.
Yeah, wind took off dramatically. And then China entered the game in a massive way.
Setting ambitious renewable energy goals, becoming a manufacturing powerhouse.
Dominating global production of solar panels and wind turbines through strong industrial policy and targets.
But Jürgen cautions these energy transitions take a long time, historically speaking.
Decades, even centuries. So renewables will likely keep growing, but their ultimate share depends on continued policy support, falling costs, and crucially, more innovation.
And it's not just startups anymore, is it? Big traditional energy companies are involved?
Yeah.
Venture capital?
Increasingly so. The sheer scale of the market, the $6 trillion number, again, is attracting massive investment. Venture capital really started flowing into energy and clean tech around 2003, 2004.
Looking for the next big thing.
Exactly. Trying to replicate successes like early solar pioneers or companies like Q-Cells in Germany that grew rapidly thanks to those feed-in tariffs.
But wind and solar still face challenges, right? Intermittency is the big one.
It's fundamental. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So you need backup power, usually natural gas or energy storage, which adds cost and complexity to managing the grid.
And wind farms often need new transmission lines because the best wind resources are far from cities.
Often, yes. Building out that infrastructure is another major hurdle and expense. The wind industry itself has seen boom and bust cycles. Lots of U.S. companies went bankrupt in the 90s when tax credits expired.
But came back strong in the mid-2000s, driven by state-level mandates.
Renewable portfolio standards, requiring utilities to get a certain percentage of power from renewables. That, plus renewed federal incentives, fueled a resurgence. And then Chinese manufacturers entered the market aggressively.
And now there's offshore wind, especially in Europe.
That's seen as the next big frontier. Stronger, more consistent winds offshore, but it's significantly more expensive and technically challenging to build and maintain turbines out at sea, the marinized frontier, as Jürgen puts it.
Let's circle back to energy efficiency. You mentioned Japan being a leader.
Since the 70s oil crises, really, they had to optimize energy use out of necessity. Jürgen mentions the cultural concept of makanai, a sense that things are too precious to waste. That mindset helps.
And technology plays a role now, too. Smart meters.
Big potential there. Advanced meters give consumers and utilities much more detailed information on energy usage patterns. That enables targeted conservation efforts, better grid management.
It also potential downsides. Cybersecurity.
That's a growing concern. As the grid becomes more complex, more interconnected, more reliant on IT systems, it also becomes more vulnerable to cyber attacks, a major security challenge.
What about biofuels? Ethanol. It's had a bit of a checkered history.
It has. Early interest faded after WWII. Then it got a boost in the 70s from the oil shocks, and also as a way to help struggling farmers gas a hole.
And President Bush later promoted it heavily as a national security strategy.
Yes, framing it as a way to reduce oil dependence. Brazil, of course, has had huge success with ethanol from sugarcane. It's a major transportation fuel there.
But harder to replicate in the U.S.
Much harder just because the sheer scale of the U.S. gasoline market is so vast. Making a significant dent requires enormous volumes. Plus, there were debates about the impact on food prices and the environment.
And there's ongoing work on advanced biofuels. Cellulosic ethanol.
Yeah, trying to make ethanol from non-food sources like switchgrass or agricultural waste. Technically challenging, but potentially much more sustainable if they can crack the code economically.
Looking at transportation more broadly, it's amazing how much has changed. From steam engines dominating.
To the internal combustion engine, auto's design taking over. Though electric vehicles were actually early contenders too, Edison worked hard on batteries for them.
Hard to imagine now, but cars faced skepticism early on.
Oh yeah, opposition even. Seen as noisy, dangerous, unreliable, took time to win acceptance. Then, much later, fuel efficiency rules like CAFE standards started pushing manufacturers to improve mileage.
Which ironically led to the rise of SUVs and light trucks, because they had looser standards initially.
Partly, yes. That was an unintended consequence. Now we're seeing another potential shift with companies like Tesla making high-performance electric vehicles desirable.
But batteries and charging are still the big hurdles.
The battery race is intense, trying to improve range, lower costs, speed up charging. And building out ubiquitous, reliable charging infrastructure is a massive undertaking.
So Jürgen's outlook is that oil's dominance in transport will likely shrink.
Gradually, yes. Due to a combination of more efficient gasoline cars, the rise of EVs, and potentially more biofuels. But it won't disappear overnight.
Which brings us to the final theme, energy security. Still a fundamental concern.
Absolutely. The basic worry about having reliable, affordable energy supplies hasn't gone away. We still see unexpected threats, like hurricanes knocking out production.
And the threats are evolving. Cybersecurity again.
Yes. As economies and technologies change, so do the security risks. Protecting the increasingly digitalized electric grid from cyber attacks is a major new dimension of energy security.
So pulling all these threads together from Jürgen's work, what's the path ahead look like?
Well, it's clear renewables like wind and solar have made huge strides, but they still need to prove they can deliver reliable, large-scale power competitively, especially dealing with intermittency.
Energy efficiency remains paramount.
Top priority. And we have better tools and technologies for it than ever before. Fundamentally, though, Jürgen emphasizes the search for knowledge innovation driven by research and development as the engine of progress.
But the scale of the challenge is just daunting, isn't it? Meeting future energy needs for a growing world sustainably.
It's enormous. There are no easy answers. It's going to require responsible and efficient energy use, absolutely, sound judgment in policymaking, consistent investment over the long term.
Statesmanship, collaboration.
Collaboration internationally, definitely. Long-term thinking and always integrating environmental considerations deeply into energy strategies.
Okay, so what does this all boil down to for you, the listener? Hopefully this deep dive has given you a much clearer, maybe more nuanced picture of the huge forces shaping our energy world.
Yeah, the interplay between technology, economics, geopolitics. It's constant, complex.
You've seen how predictions can go wrong, how unexpected technologies emerge. Maybe you had an aha moment about that cycle of crisis and innovation, or how interconnected global markets really are now.
This really does set up a fascinating question as we wrap up. Given this whole history we've explored, all the twists and turns, the surprises, what unexpected innovation do you think might be the next major game changer?
Yeah, something maybe not getting the headlines right now.
Exactly, something that could disrupt the landscape in ways we aren't quite anticipating yet.
Definitely something to ponder. Thank you so much for sharing your sources with us and trusting us to take this deep dive with you. We really hope it's been valuable.
Indeed. Until our next exploration.